Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on DevOps Automation Principles. My name is Shakti Kannan. My online presence goes by the name Shaktiman. You can also reach me at author@shaktiman.com. This presentation is freely available under a GNU free documentation license. So this allows you to share the presentation, make modifications and enhancements to it as long as you give credit to my initial work. So I am a free software enthusiast. I have around 15 years of experience in the industry. My blog, gallery and presentations are available on my domain shaktiman.com. I'm also the author of this book, I Want to Do Project, Tell Me What to Do, which basically introduces people to free, libre and open source software. My community work and GitLab URLs are also available for your reference. I am known as mbuff on Internet Relay Chat. So when I wanted to prepare the content for this webinar, I looked at the DevOps automation principles under three different entities: technology, process and people. The most important among these is of course people. We will look at each one of these entities in different sections. So the first entity that we will be discussing is on technology. In the beginning days, we had system administrators who used to do things manually on each and every server. They used to write scripts to automate things, but it was all manual driven for most of the work. So the infrastructure that was there was called as divergent infrastructure. The reason being that each individual used to work on one or more servers, and if you needed some information on a specific instance, you had to go and talk to people and find out what had changed. This of course doesn't scale very well, but that was what existed in the early days. A quick note: for all the images that I have used in this presentation, I have provided the source link at the bottom of the slide. So we then have tools being developed which try to bring the state of the infrastructure to a state that we desire. So we had tools like CF Engine, Ansible, Puppet and Chef, and more recently Terraform and SaltStack. And all these tools helped us to converge the infrastructure to a state that we want them to be in. So these had scripts that we write, there were some automated tasks that we perform, and all of these are revision controlled in, say, Git, for example. So this led to a convergent infrastructure where we had some control of the state of all the nodes that are part of the setup. What we need to move towards is what is known as congruent infrastructure. All of us during our school days, we would have studied on congruent triangles. So what are these? These are triangles where you can scale them to any magnitude, but the properties of the angles remain the same. So if we apply this analogy to infrastructure, we want to make sure that each server, when we scale out, has the same desired properties that we want them to be in. So this is the congruent infrastructure principle that we want all our servers to be in. Fundamentally, there are two models of deployment. Earlier we had the pull-based setup, where we set up a master or agent on each and every server instance, and this master pulls the configuration changes from a repository and it applies those changes to the server. And then later on, tools like Ansible started to promote the push-based setup. Say, for example, you as a consultant are given SSH access to a infrastructure and you want to push all the required changes to the server, then you can use this model. But today we also see a hybrid approach that is prevalent, where let's say for provisioning hardware you actually use a push-based setup and then you deploy a master or agent on the individual nodes, and then you use a pull-based setup to fetch the required configuration changes from a central server, and then you make the necessary changes. But fundamentally there are two principles of deployment. One is the pull-based approach and the push-based approach. Idempotence is a very important property that we want in infrastructure. The principle states that here in this example, if you apply 5 times 1, the result is always 5, right? So applying this to our infrastructure, a number of times we apply our Ansible playbooks or chef recipes, we want the infrastructure to be in the required state that we want it to be in. So if there is a change that is required, that will be applied, and if there is no change that is required, then the operation will not do any specific modification to the server. So you should be able to apply any one of your procedures on the infrastructure and it should retain the desired properties that are expected. So the law of identity is an example of this idempotent property. So when we talk about infrastructure, there are 3 important aspects that you need to keep in mind. The first thing is what comprises your infrastructure. So in this example, we have a database cluster and we have our web servers. Okay. And secondly, where do you want to host your infrastructure? So it could be, if you're using AWS, for example, you could be hosting it on Eastern region or then in a Western region as well. And the third aspect is what is the purpose or when do you want to use this infrastructure? So it could be a staging environment or it could be a production environment. So at a high level, you should have a very good picture about your infrastructure in terms of the different components that comprise that, where are you hosting them, and when do you want to use them. So this is an example of Aerospike database cluster and web servers across 2 different regions, and you have both staging and production environments. The format described here is the example of the Ansible inventory group. So once you have your infrastructure, you should definitely have good monitoring in place. It is very important to measure, monitor, and then analyze all the metrics. A common question that people usually ask is, what are the important metrics that we need to keep an eye on? Is it just CPU? Is it just RAM? Is it just storage? So the important aspect here is the key performance indicators for your operations as well as for your business. So you need to first define those, and then you need to monitor them, keep measuring them, and do a periodic analysis on those metrics. And as and when you need more fine-grained metrics, you can add them to your monitoring stack. But having a very, very good analysis of your entire pipeline is also very important. When it comes to scaling, there are two ways you can scale out. One is horizontal scaling, the other is vertical scaling. So when we say horizontal scaling, we mean that you can add more nodes or instances to your infrastructure. When we mean vertical scaling, we mean adding a higher CPU or more RAM or more storage per node. So initially you can start with a minimal setup for your infrastructure, and as and when you do the monitoring and analysis, you will be able to make a decision on how you want to scale and when you want to scale out. A lot of the free, libre and open source software that we use today have come from the free software principles. The ability for you to use the software, to study the source code, to share the software, and also make changes and make improvements to it. And this has been a fundamental principle for a very, very long time. So understanding the four freedoms and the free software philosophy is essential. A very good resource that I would recommend is the book by Richard Stallman. It's titled Free as in Freedom. It will show you the history of free software and how the whole movement began. And today most of our stack that we use come under the free, libre and open source software. So this is a very important aspect in our domain. A lot of the tools or technologies that you use have a history, and most of the time we don't read the history, and hence we don't understand the rationale or reason behind creating the tool in the first place. History teaches us a lot of good lessons. So reading about the tool, the creation of the tool, the context in which it was created, where it is useful, all these will help you in actually deciding if a particular tool or technology is useful for you. So try to read about the history of different tools and understand why they were invented in the first place and what are the problems that they are trying to solve. So with that, let's move to the process entity. So this is a good analogy that I would like to compare the DevOps pipeline with. The way you do the design, development, testing, and deployment, I like to think of it as a magnetic flux that flows through a magnet. So you could be doing multiple deployments in a day, right? And this is how the pipeline looks like as a open loop. But sometimes you do have maintenance tasks that you do. It could be scheduled jobs that you run, or it could be backups that you take. Those are less frequent, okay, but you still do them as part of your routine job activities. So this is a good example of an open and closed loop that exists in your DevOps pipeline. The first and foremost thing with respect to your process is that you should always try to do the simplest thing, the minimal thing that is required to get the job done. This is heavily promoted in the extreme programming practices. I would definitely recommend going through this website as well. Even if you have a complex problem, try to find a simple solution. And that is something that is understandable to you and for others as well. So the message is that always try to do the simplest thing that is possible. Many environments I have seen that people don't use a staging for their testing, and they mostly have a production environment. The Git version control tool does it very nicely and explicitly by having a staging area when you want to work on development. From your working directory, you make the changes and push it to a staging area, do all your testing there, and then you commit it to your Git repository. Similarly, when you are dealing with infrastructure and your DevOps pipeline, it is very, very essential that you have a staging or test environment that is very, very close to your production environment, so that you can actually do the test for all your changes, and it also gives you the confidence that you are ready to push those changes to production. Time is a very important component. You should always measure the different tasks that you are performing on a day-to-day basis. If you find that there are repetitive tasks, then you should make sure that you try to automate them using some script, so that when you are done with those tasks, you can always move on to taking more work. That way your learning improves and you also gain more experience. So measuring time is very, very essential, and try to keep track of how much time you are spending on various tasks. As Professor Donald Knuth has said, premature optimization is the root of all evil, and the optimization phase is something that comes very late in the entire process. You don't think about it when you begin, but this is something that you should incorporate when you do your analysis and feedback. So this should help you in reviewing your past work and see if you can improve the pipeline performance, storage, cost, etc. The rollback option is essential for any task that you do. So this is an example of Nix OS, which allows you to configure your entire operating system and applications in a text file, and you can actually roll back the different versions and move the system to the desired configuration that you want to use. So for whatever tasks that you perform, if you are moving from point A to point B, make sure that you have a rollback plan from point B back to point A. Sometimes you might also need to have a plan B option. If a particular procedure does not work and the clock is ticking, you need to make a decision whether you want to take another route or another method to solve the problem. So just as you have a rollback option, having a plan B is also essential. This is a Latin phrase which basically asks the question, who watches the watchman, or who will guard the guards themselves. Having a backup policy is very essential, and there are people who do take secondary backups, and sometimes these backups are also stored in fire safe vaults, and this depends on the sensitivity of the data that you are dealing with, but having a good backup policy and secondary backups is very, very important. The recovery path can vary depending on the amount of operations that you are doing. Ideally, you should have enough automation scripts such that you can restore the complete data center infrastructure from your automation. This includes setting up your DNS, your load balancers, your web servers, application servers, database servers, etc. Now, of course, you should have multiple data centers to handle different traffic patterns and user data. I mean, there should not be a single point of failure, but being able to restore a complete data center in case it goes down is very, very important. And ideally, you want to have 100% automation coverage for your recovery process. Professor Donald Knuth talks about the literate programming style. There is a very good talk by Howard on literate DevOps using GNU Emacs. There's a nice video available online, you can look that up, where the code and the documentation are interleaved, and it sort of gives you a complete document on the operations that you have performed with the output and the necessary explanations. So this style of programming is something that we should move towards and use a lot. A very common question that people ask is, which tool should we use? Now, the different tools have been created for different purposes to solve different problems by different people. So it's very important to understand the context and then use the right tool for the right job at the right time with the right people. So there is no one tool that solves all the problem. So it is important to use the right tool for the right job. So we now move on to the most important entity, the people. Now, traditionally, we've had teams where we had developers who do only the development, and then we have people who do the operations aspect. But today, many people state that DevOps is not a role, but it is a culture. The way you do your development, your testing, your releases, your deployments, your monitoring, etc. There are smaller teams which have people who work on both development and operations. So for them, it is more of a role than just a culture. But how tightly this dev and ops work together in a more efficient way is what defines your entire DevOps cycle. Whatever tasks that you perform, I want you to think in terms of the 5 W's and 1 H. What is the task you are doing? Why is it that you are doing it? Why should you be the person who is doing it? Where do you want to execute the tasks, and when do you want to do it? And the details on how you are going to do it. All these questions need to be answered by you, and you need to clearly understand what you are doing. This will greatly help you in the long run. So always think in terms of the 5 W's and 1 H. So when we start in our career, we have some basic knowledge, and then we have to acquire more skills and knowledge. So this is part of the whole career plan that you have, and once you have gained the experience, then you become a craftsman where you can create new skills for creating new products and basically lead in the industry. So you start from basic knowledge and you acquire more skills, and then you end up being a craftsman with creating more knowledge, skills, and providing products and services. So acquiring knowledge and technical skills is something that each individual should really focus on. Frederick Brooks has a wonderful book called The Mythical Man Month, and it clearly states that adding more people to a late project makes it even later. And I have mostly seen that small teams that are very focused are able to deliver things on time and are more efficient. The larger the team size, there is more communication overhead. A number of enterprises also operate with small teams that are very efficient. So it is very important that each individual in the team is able to communicate effectively with each other and they work together coherently to get the work done. Frederick Brooks also has another book, the Essay of Essays from a software engineering perspective. The Design of Designs is a very good book that I would recommend on the essays of software engineering. Distributed teams are quite a challenge because they are based on different time zones. What is very important here is again communication, where you want to make sure the handover between teams is very fluent. Now, whenever you are finishing up your tasks, you want to ensure that the next person or team that is going to resume the work or continue with the work have enough information on what you have done. It is quite challenging when you want to work in this distributed environment, but again it is a 24/7 operation, and hence effective communication between teams is essential. If you are stuck or you have a serious problem, it is very important that you raise the flag. You make sure that you inform your superiors or your manager that you're really stuck and you need help. Most of the time, sometimes people just waste time on trying to solve things, but it is important to understand that there are deadlines and you need to work towards that. So if you really run out of solutions, then raising the flag is good, so that then you can always look at alternative ways of solving the problem, and the business people can actually take a decision from the management perspective on how to proceed. So if you're stuck, if you need really help, do raise the flag. Acquiring skills and gaining knowledge are very important, and having the habit of reading is essential even on a daily basis. So spend at least an hour every day to read and gain more knowledge. You have to be up to date with what's going on in the industry and in academia, and hence it is important to have the reading habits. The same applies to writing as well. So when you do your daily work, it is good to keep a journal or an internal blog where you document everything that you are doing, because this helps as a reference not just for you but also for your team members. If someone wants to try something out that is similar to what you are doing, your reference notes will be very useful for them. Also, if you go on a vacation and you come back to work and you want to know what you did, the task that you did prior to your vacation, you can go through your blog notes and you will understand what is it that you have done. So documentation is very useful and very important, and having the practice to write daily with all the details, it could be command line options, it could be output, it could be screenshots, it could be log messages. All this information is very, very useful. And last but not the least, as an individual, you should seek out feedback from your peers and also from your superiors. So this will greatly help you understand your strengths and weaknesses, and you should try to work on your short-term and long-term goals and see how you can convert your weaknesses into strengths. So having periodic reviews will be really helpful for you for your long-term career. So that's all I had on these important principles. My email address is author@shaktiman.com, and my online presence goes by the name Shaktiman. Thank you.